problem with being too loud, so. Okay, comrades. Test. Class in Russia to power. So we see the Bolsheviks as a role model to base our work on. And the discussion will help to raise the level of us to build the parties we are building all over the world now to fight for socialism in our lifetime. But just before we start, I have a few announcements. Nani lost his USB drive. If anybody picks up a USB drive, please come to me. The same goes for if you have an intervention, please come to me in the pause. Antonio will speak for 45 minutes plus 45 minutes translation. And afterwards we will have a break for the comrades at the screening that you know. We will break the stream after the lead-off. Yes, so just for the comrades here, one last point. When you enter the main room, please use the front doors for the stewards to check your credentials. And be on time, as we don't have too much time for the comrades back home waiting for us. So, all the technical problems are solved, I hope. Because now, without further ado, Antonio will speak.
Comrades, well, what the Bolsheviks achieved in 1917 has no parallel in history up to the present day. A country of 160 million people. When the revolution broke out, the Bolsheviks had 8,000 members. That's one Bolshevik for every 20,000 inhabitants in the country. That would be like a revolution breaking out here in Italy, country of 69 million, and starting with a party of like 3,500 people. And within the space of the next 8 months, the party grew 30-fold. And it won the support of millions. It overthrew the provisional government. It brought the Soviets to power. And it built the first workers' government in history that was able to hold on to power. They particularly won the working class, which was a minority of the Russian population. If you take just the industrial factory workers of Russia, by October, nearly 1 out of 15 of them was a member of the Bolshevik Party. Now, we don't have time to have a detailed review of 1917 itself, but my goal is to discuss what it took to prepare the Bolsheviks for October. What was it that made those 8,000 Bolsheviks capable of performing what appeared to be a miracle? Because if we ask ourselves, what does it mean to build a Bolshevik party? At what point do we get to look back at our work and say, good work, comrades, we did it. We have a Bolshevik party now. That day will only come when we're prepared to carry out the same achievement that the Bolsheviks did. In the last decade, there was a wave of a different type of socialism that became popular around the world. I'm talking about the 2010s. And in the US, it was the Sanders craze and Corbyn in Britain. And that trend had a mouthpiece. It had a publication that came along with it, Jacobin magazine. And they published an article for the centenary of the October Revolution in 2017. It's called The New Communists. And it has some advice for us. It says, stop worrying about the old answers to old questions. Today, the probability of a socialist revolution is infinitesimally small. The world's working class has moved on, and yet the far left today embraces the Soviet obsession like a vampire hunter wields garlic. They say the left is held back by its inability to move on from these dreams of apocalyptic rupture. Well, that's the voice of a petty bourgeois variety of socialism that is currently withering into dust. The young generation has not moved on from dreams of revolution. Instead, they moved on from Jacobin magazine. They moved on from a brand of democratic socialism that would sneer at October. History has moved on from them. Does anyone remember what was happening in the United States 4 years ago this week? I think Donald Trump remembers, because he was hiding in a bunker under the White House. And there were 26 million people in the streets. And Trump ordered the U.S. Army to prepare to deploy across U.S. cities within the space of 5 hours. And dozens of generals at the Pentagon were warning him that he risked playing his last card if he did that. And 54% of the population thought it was justified when protesters in Minneapolis burnt down the police precinct. And in a growing number of neighborhoods, regular working class people were taking up arms and setting up patrols to defend their neighborhoods against the police and against right-wing thugs. So it's not such an old question, is it? I'm very interested in how the Bolsheviks pulled off their miracle. Because there's nothing more important in my life than participating in the replication of that achievement in the United States in my lifetime, just like thousands of us are trying to achieve around the world. At the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920, delegates from around the world showed up in Moscow, an international gathering, something like this international gathering. And in their rooms, the delegates found some Congress documents that they had to read to prepare for the proceedings. One of them was a booklet that Lenin had written for the delegates. And it was intended to teach them how the Bolsheviks achieved victory so that they could apply the lessons in their own countries. It was called Left-Wing Communism, an infantile disorder. And I love that the beginning of the book just dives right in, so concise, so clear. He starts an indispensable condition for the success of the Bolsheviks. He said, we could not have retained power for 2.5 months, let alone 2.5 years, without the most rigorous and truly iron discipline in our party. He says, overthrowing the bourgeoisie is impossible without a long, stubborn, desperate life and death struggle. It calls for tenacity, for self-sacrifice, for a single, inflexible will. Lenin explains that as a current of political thought and as a political party, Bolshevism began since in 1903. And he said, only the history of Bolshevism during its entire existence can explain where that discipline came from. He gives a few of the main points to explain where that discipline came from. First, it comes from something inside the proletarian vanguard. There has to be a generation with a sense of self-sacrifice and devotion. That comes from class consciousness, from recognizing your position in society. It also comes from history, from living in a society that makes people say, I want nothing more than to bring this system down. Lenin says, secondly, those people have to be merged with the working class. They have to sink roots. It's like a plant needs to be anchored in the soil. And it's moving, those roots are collecting nutrients from the soil, and the party is sending ideas into the working class, but it's also receiving insights from the working class. Lenin said the third condition is the party has to have correct ideas. It needs to have the right tactics, the right strategy. It needs to understand where reality is heading. And the working class has to be able to verify through their own experience that the party's position is correct. Lenin explains that Bolshevism arose on the granite foundation of Marxist theory. And really, the party was a vehicle for transmitting those ideas. It was training leaders who could use Marxism to actually think, to apply it to reality. And finally, Lenin points out in this chapter that there was 15 years of really intense experience that the party went through leading up to 1917. It was unequaled anywhere in the world in such a short space of time to go through so many forms of the movement. Legal and illegal, peaceful and stormy, underground and open, local circles, mass movements, parliamentary forms, and battles on the barricades. All of that was necessary to train the cadres of Bolshevism. They needed ideological training, they needed a disciplined structure, they needed to have fierce internal debates and be connected to the international debates of the Marxist movement. They had to go through multiple revolutions, multiple wars, multiple periods of reaction. The benefit is that all of that happened in a pretty short space of time, and it produced these cadres. When we define Bolshevism, we often refer to like psychological traits, like having an iron will, the determination to smash all obstacles. I think these are part of the definition. I think it contains part of the picture. Because you can imagine what it would mean if you think to lead a modern day uprising of the working class. You better have something special. You need a strong psychology. You need an ideological backbone. But this is one of the best definitions that I've seen of Bolshevism was published by the Communist International in 1925. Bolshevism is not merely a doctrine, but a system of revolutionary training for the proletarian uprising. And what does the revolutionary training of the cadres consist of? It is giving them such a training and effecting such a selection of the leading staff as would prevent them from drifting when the hour for their October strikes. I think that's an excellent definition of Bolshevism. That was written by the architect of the October insurrection himself, Leon Trotsky. The Bolshevik Party was a party of cadres. It was a cadre organization. When you have a small, well-organized body that has a lot of expertise, and it's capable of expanding rapidly into a massive force and taking in a big influx of new people and transmit organization and expertise to that big expanded body, that's the general function of a cadre organization in the abstract. I have a dictionary definition here of a cadre. A group of trained or otherwise qualified personnel capable of forming, training, or leading an expanded organization. Now think about it in a wartime context. This is used often in a military sense. Militaries will define a cadre as a key group of officers and enlisted personnel necessary to establish and train a new military unit. Think about the process of raising an army for a wartime mobilization. You have a draft, a wartime conscription, and broad layers of the population are being drafted into the army. And new soldiers, they're enlisted, they're put through a rapid basic training. And the goal is to make them battle ready in the shortest possible space of time. And then they're given a weapon, they're assigned to a unit, they're given their marching orders on the battlefield. Well, in 1917, those 8,000 Bolsheviks were the general staff of October. And they raised a mass revolutionary party in much the same way. Remember, starting from 8,000, they grew 30-fold. That's 250,000. And that averages out to, if you were to take that increase and average it out over those 8 months, that's 1,000 people joining you every day for 8 months. But instead of arming them with a gun and deploying them on the battlefield, they armed them with a program. And they were assigned to go back to their workplace and explain the program to their coworkers and win them over to it. Of course, the general staff that raises an army has to be very well trained. The bourgeois states have their military academies, and they don't just train their staff to just give commands. They train them in the theory of war. They study history. They study society. They even study psychology. They need to have the ability to think under immense pressure. Well, again, the entire history of the Bolshevik Party created those kinds of people. I want to run through some of this history, beginning with the early beginnings. The forerunners of the Bolshevik, there was a pre-Marxist revolutionary movement called the Narodniks. Their slogan was, "Go to the people." And they thought the peasantry was going to be the force to carry out a revolution. And most of these were middle-class students and intellectuals. And they gave up their normal lives and comforts to try and spark a peasant uprising to bring down the Tsar. This started in the 1860s. It kind of reached a high point in the 1870s. It reached a crisis in the 1880s. And the tactics varied, but the movement became a terrorist movement. These were young kids building bombs and trying to assassinate Tsarist officials. And they actually killed one of the Tsars, Alexander II, in 1881. Lenin's own brother was a Narodnik. And he was arrested for his attempt to assassinate Alexander III, the Tsar, the next Tsar. He was in prison for several months, and then one day the jailer comes and says, "You have 2 hours left. We're going to hang you." And his final words were the words of a revolutionary. He said, "I had but one aim, to help the unfortunate Russian people. There is no finer death. Such a death holds no terror for sincere and honest men." Well, that honest man had just turned 21 years old. These people were willing to sacrifice their lives for the cause. As far as tenacity and self-sacrifice goes, these people were heroes. And that spirit of Narodnism was inherited by the Bolsheviks. They had the tenacity, but they didn't have the roots in the working class, and they didn't have the correct ideas. By the 1880s, the movement was at an impasse because all the leaders were imprisoned. And they had made no headway winning the peasantry. And in the year 1880, one of these Narodniks had to flee abroad, and he discovers the ideas of Marxism. And it was life-changing. It blew his mind. The answers to all of the questions that he had. And this is a quote from that man. "Anyone who did not live through those times can hardly imagine the eagerness with which we threw ourselves into the study of Marxist literature. The more we read, the more we realized the weak points of our earlier views. The theories of Marx, they guided us out of this labyrinth that we were stuck in." That was Georgy Plekhanov, the father of Russian Marxism. In 1883, he founded the first Marxist organization in Russia, the Emancipation of Labor Group. And it's pretty amazing if you think that's a huge country, 140 million probably at the time. And there's no Marxists there. Pretty much no one's heard of Marxism. It has no influence. This group of 5 people has no resources or visibility. And they're trying to bring a new ideology into that kind of scenario. That was 1883. Now think of the timeline. By the end of the 1890s, by the end of the following decade, here's how Lenin described the political landscape. Marxist books were published one after another. Marxist journals and newspapers were founded. Nearly everyone became a Marxist. Anyway, the point is the entire revolutionary movement abandoned Narodnism and shifted over to Marxism. It was a very dramatic shift. And the revolutionary generation felt illuminated by materialism, by dialectics, by historical materialism. The effect was that there was a mushrooming, a spontaneous popping up of Marxist discussion groups all over Russia. It started with intelligentsia and students, and these were really dense writings. They were studying theory and philosophy. They were studying the roots of Marxism. But in the 1890s, the working class was growing rapidly. There was a rapid industrialization. And suddenly the class struggle became something very concrete. The theory and reality corresponded perfectly. So the movement made efforts to bring these ideas to the working class. They were forming circles of factory workers who were studying Marxist theory. Meanwhile, the entire apparatus of Tsarism that had been hunting the Narodniks for decades is now targeting the Marxists and arresting them and confiscating their literature. This was the state of the movement when Lenin began his political activity. He became active in 1893 in St. Petersburg. Within 2 years, he was arrested, like so many other revolutionaries. He wasn't released for 5 more years. He spent 5 years in Tsarist prisons and exile, thinking, reading, studying, but also analyzing the movement. He was obsessively developing a plan. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party was actually founded while he was in exile. And I should explain that the social democracy at the time was the way that the international Marxist movement referred to itself. The Second International had been founded in 1889, less than a decade before this party had been founded. Anyway, Lenin was in Siberia drafting Congress documents that were smuggled to this Congress. There was just 9 delegates. Almost all of them were immediately arrested after the Congress, and that was it. Lenin saw that the party was beginning. It was taking steps forward, but there was so much that still remained to be done. Lenin was released in 1900, and he immediately got to work transforming those scattered, disorganized forces into a professional, effective revolutionary party. He wrote What is to be Done. And this was a really sharp polemic. Just like Plekhanov, Lenin learned, he took a lot from Plekhanov, but he learned this really incredible polemical style. And when you read it, it can sometimes seem like a vicious beatdown. But there wasn't anything mean-spirited about him. He had one concern: clarity. How do you get the cadres to see the mistake, the inconsistency of the opponent? Well, this is what he does in What Is to Be Done. He's polemicizing against different publications, against a trend called The Economists. That can be summed up by saying, the economic struggle is for the workers, leave the political struggle to the liberals. It had this condescending middle-class view that the workers were incapable of grappling with theory, and really it was opening the door to a soft version of Marxism, a reformist version of Marxism. The essence of the argument in What Is to Be Done is that the movement has been going through phases. Lenin's analyzing the development of the movement. He said, we've made huge strides. We have all of these circles springing up everywhere, but it has serious shortcomings. It's amateurish, it's uncoordinated, it's disorganized, it's chaotic. And the worst part is this is supposed to be a Marxist movement and its leaders are vacillating on their Marxism. Well, What Is to Be Done was like a battle plan for addressing the situation. Bringing order and professionalism to the scattered circles and putting Marxism at the center of it, using the ideas of Marxism to build a disciplined core. Launching the paper Iskra in 1900 was a practical major step in this direction. It wasn't just a paper, it was a network of agents that brought consciousness to all of the circles that they were part of one big phenomenon. The movement started to recognize itself. It started to talk to each other. They were reading each other's reports. And this was, again, a period of establishing order. You had committees, one committee in every city. Below the committee, you had district committees. Those district committees coordinated factory committees. The factory committees had subcommittees. And there was a whole web of technical committees. This is where the word committee man comes from this period. But you needed a detailed division of labor in order to conduct clandestine work. This was the situation at the time of the Second Congress in 1903. And without getting into details of the debate that took place there, it was a struggle over what kind of party are we going to have. Will it be a professional cadre organization or a broad, loose organization? It seemed to be a clash over organizational questions, but it had a deeper significance. Lenin said later those differences really only came out in 1905. And that year was like a trial by fire for all the parties. Bloody Sunday, January 9th, 140,000 march, petition the Tsar. Over 4,000 are shot in cold blood by the Tsarist officials. Hundreds of them die. Just like that, a revolution began. The workers are picking up the bodies and carrying them on carts through the city, marching, saying, give us arms. 3 million workers go on a political strike, and then it escalates into an insurrection. In this situation, the party needed a totally different form. That cadre skeleton needed the influx. It needed to do what it's supposed to do and expand. The party committees resisted. See how that period of discipline, of trying to tighten things up, that created habits that then became an obstacle when the situation changed. Lenin said that every month of 1905 was like a year's worth of education during normal periods. You had the rise of the Soviets out of strike committees. They represented hundreds of thousands of workers across hundreds of factories. They coordinated strikes, but through the strike action, they were actually playing the role of a governing force. They achieved freedom of press. They had a shorter working day. They took over the railways, the telegraphs, the postal service. They set up regular street patrols. They were acting like a government. Well, there was different conceptions of what the Soviets represented. The Mensheviks supported the Soviets, and they even helped set them up. But they thought the Soviets should be like a non-political labor congress. Or they thought it could become like a reformist labor party, like a European workers' party. This was the position of the Mensheviks. And really, the Mensheviks had kind of grown out of economism. They wanted to adapt the workers' movement to the interests of the liberal capitalist class, because their view of Marxism was a rigid view. They thought that Tsarism represented, because it was a remnant of feudalism, then Tsarism should be overthrown and replaced by capitalism. And therefore, the task of the revolutionary movement should be to support the liberals against the Tsar. The position of Lenin in relation to the tasks of the revolution, he didn't have any illusions in the capitalist class. He thought Tsarism should be replaced by a coalition between the workers and the peasantry. He called it a democratic dictatorship of the peasantry and the proletariat. And basically, this would exclude the bourgeoisie, and it would achieve democratic rights for the workers. He said a revolution that achieved that would then it would have a huge impact in Europe. And once the workers of Europe move, then they could advance to a socialist revolution. But when the Soviets emerged, Lenin's position evolved a little bit. He saw the Soviets and he said this could be the embryo of a workers' government. That was exactly Trotsky's position, by the way. And I should explain that in 1903, when you had that really intense factional fight between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, when it appeared to be over organizational issues like an unjustified reason to split the party, at that specific juncture, Trotsky sided against Lenin with the Mensheviks. As soon as those divisions started to exhibit political content, Trotsky became independent of both factions, and he had the perspective that it should be possible to bring everyone together, to win everyone to a correct position, and have a large unified party. He probably looked at Lenin and said, you have a hard-line view. You're not allowing the party to come together. Well, I believe Trotsky looked back at that position and said that was the greatest mistake of his life. And maybe it was those 5 years in exile in prison that allowed Lenin to see this thing very clearly. He saw it more clearly than anybody else. Lenin wanted ideological homogeneity. A party of people that think the same way, that are rowing in the same direction, who are completely devoted, who are not competing. The party's not competing for their time and attention with other interests. No, the truth is the Mensheviks wanted the party to be open to like fellow travelers, intellectuals, and sympathetic people. So those were the two trends in Russian social democracy. They ended up really diverging later. But I mention this because at every juncture, the political position of Lenin and Trotsky was almost exactly the same. At an early stage, Lenin had seen this. He had tried to get Trotsky to join the Iskra editorial board. Anyway, once the split happened, Trotsky was not a Bolshevik for many years. Anyway, that's an aside. Going back to 1905, Lenin and Trotsky both see the Soviets as the embryo of a workers' government. But the Bolshevik committeemen, they saw the Soviets as competition against the party. They were suspicious of them. The vast majority of Bolsheviks, they were like, we should boycott the Soviet, or we should present an ultimatum that the Soviet should be under the discipline of the party, or else we should try to dissolve the Soviet. One Bolshevik in the conference in 1905 said, I think we should try to get into the Soviet and then explode it from within. Because they had been trained, we need a strict party, we need a strict line. We don't want all this variety. We don't want a non-Bolshevik party to emerge and confuse the workers. At this stage, Lenin was in a battle against his own cadres on this score as well. He had the ability to size up a situation and understand, to perceive the broader significance of events. Not just to see the immediate reality in front of him, but to anticipate the direction of events. Lenin was always concerned with preparing the party for what was about to happen, to position the party so that it could benefit from the future situation. What activity can the party do today so that it can connect with the workers tomorrow? This is dialectics, by the way. Well, on the back of 1905, eventually the party did open up to an influx. And actually, under the impact of the events, the ranks of the Bolshevik and Menshevik committees, they just started merging spontaneously. Their attitude was, yeah, we've had our differences in the past, but this is the revolution. The slogan of 1905 was down with the autocracy. They could all agree on that. They were all advocating a general strike. They wanted to move the insurrection forward. Now, what would have happened if the insurrection had succeeded in 1905? That's another question. They would not have been in agreement in that case. But at this stage, there was organic pressure for unity, and the party those factions actually did. So actually, they had a formal unity at the Stockholm Unity Congress in 1906, and they basically brought Bolshevism and Menshevism back into one happy family. Now, keep in mind, up until the breakout of 1905, the party was not big. Maybe a couple thousand, maybe the Bolsheviks numbered. Just on the back of 1905, the party became a mass force for the first time, and it grew to a mass party of 150,000. And Lenin says the hundreds of revolutionary social democrats suddenly grew into thousands, and the thousands became the leaders of between 2 and 3 million proletarians. So you can see already at this stage, that cadre function had played a massive role. Now, there was a lot of debate. It really was not a happy family. I mean, they had a lot of serious divisions. Like sometimes you like, why did this marriage? Because it was 9 years before they actually separated. But I think it had to do with the fact that social democracy was a pretty young movement international, and Marxism was having its first time as a mass phenomenon. For the longest time, it was unthinkable to have the social democrats splitting. How could you possibly split the party? And what wasn't clear at the time was that there was two souls within social democracy, even international. And the most advanced Marxists, they recognized this, and they were detecting it at an earlier stage and trying to push against it and fight against it. It had to do with the fact that capitalism at that stage, it was at a younger phase of the system. It had 40 years of an upswing up until World War I. I think Marx died in 83, Engels died in 1995, and the German SPD was huge authority in the world. It was a genuine mass party, had influence over millions. But during that long period, a process had taken place, and they had started to adapt to a comfortable, peaceful period of capitalism. The point is this conflict of this two trends that were coexisting in Russian social democracy, it's a symptom of something that was happening internationally. And the split that eventually happened foreshadowed the split that happened international, the Second International. And then anyway, I want to go back to 1905. After the defeat of that revolution, that was another phase of the cadre organization go from a small core into a massive expansion. It's not necessarily just a one-way development. You can also lose that big influx, be reduced once again. Lenin said, parties, we were learning to attack. Now we had to learn. When everything's moving forward and everyone's energy is rising and the ranks are swelling, it's all going in one direction, it can be quite easy. You feel like you're just growing because of momentum. And what Lenin understood is that this is going to recede. And now the question is, who can keep their forces intact? How do you preserve that core? The only guarantee, the only way that it's like to prepare for a period of reaction. You have one hope for getting through the other end in one piece, and that's the education of the cadre. So that was always Lenin's concern, especially when the 1905 revolution to recede. But the whole history of the party, yes, they started learning Marxism with books. That's how they started. The real education was events and then the interaction between the theory and the events. You can learn about dialectic. Everything is always changed. Everything contains something different within itself. And every situation is always in the process of bringing that other thing out. It's another thing to keep your bearings when these events are actually unfolding and the situation is being transformed dramatically. But that's the thing that Lenin would master. Anyway, one of the central points of contention, one of these debates that really educated was about the Duma. Now, this is a new situation. Tsarism, a repressive regime. There's no democratic outlet, no parliament. Of course, in 1905, the Soviets are emerging and the Tsarists were in August 1905, when the revolution was approaching its height. The regime makes a desperate attempt to channel it back into things. In an initiative under the minister Buligin, they appeal to the workers. We have something. We're going to set up a consultative body. It's not going to actually be able to make laws, but we're going to hear your voice and elect some delegates to it. It's kind of like a Soviet. The workers ignored it. It was swept away almost immediately by the revolution itself. And all the social democrats at this point had the same attitude. We boycott that. Show the workers that they have the power to dissolve this Tsarist. And don't go into an institution of the Tsar. You have the Soviets. Rely on your own. 1906, totally different situation. There was a focal point, an insurrection attempted December of 1905 in Moscow. Basically an advanced section of the workers moving, trying an armed uprising. It's already kind of gone over, appealing to the mutiny, and mutiny fails. This is when the Tsarist regime passes on to the offensive. They spot that opportunity. You have this minister Stolypin, the hangman of the revolution. He starts thousands are arrested, hundreds are executed, and now the revolution's going downhill. The Tsarist ministers decided, let's set up another Duma. Let's see if this was in 1906. And the majority of the Bolsheviks rejected. No, another sham Duma? Of course, no. We'll boycott it again. To their surprise, this time Lenin saying, wait a minute, no, the situation's changing. This is one of our only legal opportunities to put our ideas in. Lenin lost that vote and the Bolsheviks boycotted. The main liberal bourgeois party, Cadets, short for Constitutional Democrat, they flood so in this public platform that the workers are watching, there's no Marxist voice to be heard. Lenin said that was a mistake. He said it was a minor mistake, super serious. The Tsar was irritated at all this criticism he was getting from the liberals, and he decides to dissolve the Duma within 42 days anyway. In the meantime, the party is going through this intense internal battle. Do we present candidates? Do we not? Do we boycott it? Because 4 months later, the Tsar realized they needed they were caught unaware in 1905. They had no way to channel the movement. If you can set up something and then you can control it, it's a safety valve. A few months later, in November 1907, they do another Duma. And this time, more Bolsheviks are willing to support it. And the Mensheviks are very willing. They're starting to look at this like, okay, maybe we could get some reforms passed. We can pressure the Tsar. The socialists that talk about pressuring the Tsar? Well, the Tsar wasn't impressed. He wasn't pressured. And he decides to dissolve that Duma as well. And for good measure, all 54 Social Democratic delegates to that Duma were all arrested to exile. Get them out of the way. So that was called the Red Duma. Under Stolypin's initiative, set up another Duma. It's kind of like the Tsar is like using successive approximations to get the balance just right. They want the right kind of Duma. Tried the Red Duma. Now they have the Black Stolypin. Pro-Tsarist monarch dominated. Powers were even more limited than all the others. And the Tsar was pretty happy with this one. It lasted for 5 years, actually. The Bolsheviks, think about the debate about do we participate or not. Now they're looking at this Black Duma. By now they really don't want to participate in this. And Lenin has the opposite view. Really, really wants them. Fought a vicious, exhausting battle for years to convince them that they had to. And behind that immediate conflict, you could see Lenin understood how to prepare for this. This was a long period of reaction. It was a very brutal, demoralizing reaction. For the workers, that was the only public evidence of any opposition. Lenin was saying it would be criminal if we did not utilize every single opportunity, every foothold that the party has. Meantime, you have to understand the party is collapsing. From the perspective of a lot of the ranks, a lot of the core ranks, that was it. Like that was the opportunity of a lifetime. And now it's a big influx. All of those people that had recently joined the party, boom, they're gone. They're out. This period of reaction really started in 1908 and it lasted until like 1911. At one point, Lenin's in touch with like just a couple dozen people in all of Russia. It's like That's his forces. The Mensheviks are even in a worse position. I mean, they practically liquidated. So Lenin's desperately just trying to reinforce the cadres. One of the expressions of this period of reaction and demoralization was ideological wavering. Guess what? Suddenly people start to have doubts about materialism. They start to look inward like, I don't know, maybe Marxism let us down here. And they look in, it becomes a very like introspective period. People lose. Lenin was on a mission to provide perspective, to fight against that, defend material. Eventually, the Bolsheviks did come out the other end. There was light at the end of the tunnel. In 1912, there was an atrocity. The Tsarist regime massacred some workers that were striking at the Lena gold mine. And it's like it brought something back to life in the working class. It brought their anger back. It made them want to fight again. At this point, after years of these horribly frustrating debates that were happening, you understand the amount of faction in Lenin's own group, all this period of reaction. It's not just that the Bolsheviks wanted to boycott. You had 5 different trends that wanted to boycott the Duma in different ways. And the Mensheviks wanted to melt themselves in Duma and liquidate the party, be a legal faction in the parliament. And within each of the factions, there was also a lot of conciliators that wanted to strike a deal with another faction. Lenin's constantly trying to reinforce people and have something solid and find allies. Well, that was what the experience of that depressing period of reaction is like. In 1912, after that Lena massacre, when the working class starts to look up and raise its head again, it's like a breath of fresh air. Finally, now we came out of that. And this was the time when Lenin was like, enough of forming, we're going to break. And they actually have a congress of all the Bolshevik committees in the name of the RSD declared, we're the party now. But what's amazing is how the party just takes off after. It's like they had liberated themselves from the dead weight, but people that didn't get it. They have their delegates in the Duma, and they're doing it. They use dozens and dozens of opportunities to actually make revolutionary agitation, oppose the Tsarist regime. In a couple years, 4/5 of the politically active, 4/5 supporting the Bolsheviks now independently become a mass party again. The strike wave is on the rise again. Now, if you're thinking this is the phase where they prepared for October, they became a mass force, the Bolsheviks were clear. No, the whole thing collapsed again. World War I broke out, and there was a wave of patriotism, and this movement was crushed. Must have been a bit disappointing, to say the least, after that. The Bolshevik delegates, they were in the Duma when World War I broke out, and they behaved heroically. They were put under immense pressure, and instead of buckling to that pressure, they denounced the war. They refused to vote for the war credits. They make revolutionary. They're all arrested. They're all put on trial. They use the trials to do revolutionary agitation. All of them are given life sentences inside. But eventually, that paid off. The initial enthusiasm for the war didn't take long to wear off and turn into misery. And the workers remembered those speeches. They remembered the position. Lenin later said, when 1917 broke out, the revolution, one of the reasons that the Bolsheviks were able to grow dramatically, grow 30-fold, was precisely because they had been perceived by the workers as the most hardline opponents within the reaction. They had participated in all legal opportunities. They had sunk roots in the working class. And when 1917 broke out, it became clear suddenly why all of those years of intense debates were so crucial. And there was one final battle to be had. At the start of 1917, when the workers rose up and the Soviets emerge again, and this time Soviets emerge and they sweep aside the Tsarist regime. This was the real opportunity of a lifetime. It was the moment that the Bolsheviks had prepared their whole lives for. Most of the leading cadres at this time, they had joined the movement. Mostly joined in their 20s, some of them younger. And they had spent decades talking about the coming revolution, talking about this perspective in the abstract. At this moment, when they were faced with that reality, the Tsar had been overthrown, the armed workers are in the street, Soviets in practice were the ruling force. Most of the comrades didn't understand that this was the moment to bring the working class to power. As soon as Lenin arrived in Russia in April, spent 3 weeks trying to wake up the party and shake them, straining every nerve to convince them politically this is the moment. Debates in the party at that time are so fascinating. See the conflict, theory and reality, clarifying it. And the Bolshevik cadres they're using arguments that had come from the history of the party. They're saying, what about our program about the Democrat? Lenin says theory is gray, the tree of life is green. This is it. He said things played out differently than we could have ever expected, but now that the Soviets have created a power, they shouldn't have handed it back to the bourgeoisie. And that's the new power that should become the all power to the Soviet. In the time of this cadre expansion, thousands and thousands joining the party, that's what we're armed with. Go back in the April, all power to the... If you want to end the war, you have to end capitalism. We should also point out that this whole history of debates, every time there was all these crises and internal faction fights, that was a period of clarification, educated. The way that democratic centralism is something that Lenin also really developed. You have full freedom of discussion, compare all the views, take a vote, majority rules, and full unity in action. Now, in April, there was a party. And really, Lenin shocked everybody. After all those years of cadre training, it's not like you had, those 8,000 members were not 8,000 Lenin. They were cadre. They were trained in Marx. And democratic centralism allowed them to hear that view, debate, a battle of ideas. There's like an arena of ideas. Democratic centralism is designed for Marxism to prevail in that battle. Like everyone in the room is putting their Marxism together. They're putting their heads together, and it's like a collective compass. And when the correct position is put forward, that compass has to respond and say, that's it. It's the only way, the only organization form that allows an organization to have imperialist dialect, and it only works if you have a lot of Marxists, to have a core of people. Don't just have theoretical abstractions in their heads and memorize phrases. The core has to be made of people that can understand reality as it's unfolding, who are capable of recognizing the moment when it's time to gather every inch of you better get your last drop of courage because time, the ultimate time. Beginning to end, the Bolshevik Party was the history of creating Marxism. Bolshevism isn't exactly separate from Marxism. Ideologically, Marx, Engels, those ideas, that method, that's what Lenin defended. Very few people actually got it in a very deep. A lot of people filtered through those ranks. A lot of people didn't pass the test. There was a core of cadres that did. The generation of beginning, that tenacity, that first thing side created by the Tsarism. Think Tsarism force that brought it down. Comrades, modern day capitalism in 2020s even more is creating an even more destructive thing that the Narodniks felt inside. The Bolsheviks facing that. I can always produce that ingredient, that special ingredient. At certain times it pops up. Generation of people that say there is nothing more important in my life. Be a part of the end of capitalism. History is producing that. I feel it. You can feel it getting reinforced. Point is, that's one component. The other component is depth. Granite foundation of Marxist ability to think like materialists, ability to understand how the new reality is emerging, current reality, and bring these things together, comrades. The ideas of this international, create a new generation of Bolsheviks.
So thank you, Antonio, inspiring lead off. We will end the stream now for a break. We will reconvene at 11:30 sharp. Everybody stay. Comrades, we will continue now with the discussion. The first speaker will be Serena from Italy, followed by Nacho from Spain. But before that, I have 3 announcements. First, it's the Bolshevism announcement. I think it's the greatest collection of all the thoughts that Antonio just talked about in his lead-off. Then we have the new Lenin biography by Rob and Alan, which goes into detail for this period, but also adds a lot more for after the revolution and development of Lenin. And like Antonio said, there's a very condensed form of all of that in the form of left-wing communism, which is a great starting point to understand the development of the Bolshevik Party. And you can buy all of these in the bookshop, and you should also start to read yourself. That's the most important thing. So the intervention will start. It will be 6 minutes plus 6 minutes translation.
Thank you. So, comrades, I think one of the main lessons of this discussion is that the tactic to build the party is a very concrete question that must adapt to concrete conditions. And we can also see how Lenin, while developing the tactics required by every stage, often had to fight against tendency that express the pressure coming from alien classes inside the party. It was a living struggle that often expressed initially on organizational questions. For instance, in 1 step forward and 2 steps back, Lenin says, referring to the debate in the second Congress of the Social Democratic Party on the first rule of the party, that every little difference may assume tremendous importance if it serves as a starting point for a swing towards definite mistaken views. So, for example, going back to the fight against economies, in his fight on how the party should work, Lenin was fighting actually for the very existence of a party. The economists emphasized, and their main goal was the economic struggle of the working class. The political struggle was ascribed to the capitalist class. And this was an expression of the revisionism of Bernstein in Russian soil. And if all the emphasis was on the economic struggles in individual factories, the tool to do this were small, isolated, volatile circles that had no connection among them, between them, and the National Party was not required. So in writings as What is to be done, Lenin put all the emphasis on the task of overcoming the mentality of small circles, developing a national centralized organization, considering the party as a whole and not as the sum of independent groups. So in that period, the emphasis was on centralism. And there were also polemical exaggerations. In 1907, Lenin pointed out, so some years later, that the victory of the idea of a party as an organization of professional revolutionaries would have been impossible if it had not been pushed to the front line, to the forefront at the time, if we had not exaggerated. As Antonio explained, also the debate in 1903 in the Second Congress on the definition of a party members reflected deeper divisions, different viewpoints on the task of the party. In one step forward, two steps back, Lenin said, to forget this distinction between the vanguard and the whole of the masses gravitating towards it means to deceive oneself, to shut one's eyes to the immensity of our texts and to narrow down those texts. So we can see how the emphasis put by Lenin was on centralism, on defining the borders of the party, on professional methods, and this was required not only for the illegal conditions of work, but also because the party was moving its first steps that were opening up the road to connect later to wider, broader layers of the masses. So we should not surprise that in 1905, in a completely changed situation, a revolutionary situation, Lenin put forward everything he had fought against in the previous period. So, for instance, more democratic and less centralized method, like the voting system inside the party, moving up to the Unification Congress with the Mensheviks, opening up the party to the workers. He said, by hundreds and thousands, incorporate them in the ranks of the party organization, told. So, for instance, he said that the conditions, in a text of November 1905, he said, the conditions in which the party is functioning are changing radically. We must hasten to organize in a new wave. We must submit new methods. We must boldly and resolutely lay down new lines. So you can see that the emphasis, the tone, and that it was on another, on things that were opposed formally to what he had said in the previous period. So tactics is concrete, and sharp and sudden changes in the situation required sudden and sharp changes in the tactics. But we must also point out that this ability cannot consider it as something granted. I think Antonio explained this point very, very well. Lenin often met resistances inside the party from leading comrades that had adapted to the previous method of work and that had made a fetish of the previous organizational form. I think it is interesting how Lenin replied to those objecting that opening up the party in 1905 would dissolve the party among the masses. What replied Lenin to this objection? Said, this danger could undoubtedly become a very serious one if we lacked party principles, that is, program, tactical rules, organizational experience entirely. And then he said, we have insisted on the tremendous importance of continuity in the party's development. We have preached discipline and demanding that every party member be trained in one or the other of the party organization. So there lies a very important point here, I think. In the course of the life of a party, there can be different stages, different tactics, different orientations. So what is the fil rouge, or we said the unbroken thread that can keep the continuity of the party along all these different stages? I think it is what we are doing here. The political education, study of the theory, of the history, transmitting the theoretical heritage that gives the party the capacity to digest the experience through the ideas of Marxism. Because this is what gives the same political context of all different kinds of tactics that we can have, and subject these tactics to our strategic goal, to become the tool with which the working masses will overthrow capitalism.
Thank you, Serena. Next speaker will be Nacho from Spain, followed by Lucas from Germany.
Try to be brief. We're studying a living phenomenon, a success story that is the biggest success story in history. But we have to study not only victories and successes, but also weaknesses. If building a revolutionary party just involved learning a few formulas and waving the hammer and the sickle, we'd already have communism. That would be mixing up form and content, and that's what the sects do all over the world. An important task when we are learning theory is that we are able to detect patterns and tendencies. Antonio already described how the resistance of the committee men to understand the new situation, and we could refer to this as the inertia in thought. As Alan says in the Bolshevism book, a little bit of knowledge can be dangerous. When you think that you've mastered a particular idea, you can become blind and just fall over yourself. We see this inertia in thought over the question of the change in the party orientation in 1905, the Duma in 1907, and the debate over the democratic dictatorship of the peasants and the workers in 1917. We see this inertia in thought in the history of the Stalinist parties, but even in our own history, in Ted Grant's old tendency. After the 1992 split, Alan said that the party had stopped thinking, and this is something vital for us when we're building the party, that we should not stop thinking and not stop asking ourselves questions. We should not stay just on the level of abstract principles, but keep asking ourselves questions and going deeper into the theory. Trotsky once said that all abstractions can become a weapon in the hands of the class enemy. It was said yesterday that the building of the party is all about training up cadres and turning our new members into Marxists. That's the whole point. And this is an unending struggle, because we get new people coming into our ranks constantly, and we cannot just assume that those who were cadres in the past will be so for the rest of their lives. Discipline in the Bolshevik Party comes from an understanding of theory. Discipline is not the same thing as obedience. Lenin told Bukharin that if you just want obedience, you will just have a party of obedient fools. And I'll just finish with a quote from Carl Sagan. He said, science, and here we'd say Marxism, isn't just a body of knowledge, it's also a way of thinking. It's a way of analyzing, assessing the universe with a very clear understanding of the shortcomings of humans. And that's enough.
So thanks, comrade, for the very sharp intervention. Saving time helps others to get in. So the next speaker will be Lucas from Germany, followed by Evandro from Brazil. Lucas, where are you? I guess Evandro will be first, and followed by Lucas, I hope.
I'll start off with a quote Trotsky Stalin book about how the Bolsheviks looked at the youth. The liquidators used to say that Lenin was surrounded by young kids. What the liquidators saw as a disadvantage, saw as a great asset. Revolutions like war are decided by the youth. Socialist party that cannot win over the youth has no. Trotsky also devoted quite some attention to the youth. He explains in only the open-minded and determination of youth can guarantee the enthusiasm of win over the old, more tired layers of. These are just a few examples that prove that over history, revolutionary not only tried to understand the youth, but tried to win it over of the world. The Iskra days, Lenin emphasized the need of winning over the youth and winning over the youth to the ranks organizational task for, and that can only be done if they understand the importance social layer that does not belong to the but that will assist. This is an important legacy of the party. When we look at its origins, at the origins of early cadres, we can understand how they drew that. Half of the 19th century, Russia had not yet developed capitalism with world capital. In that context, a layer of the youth was awake and struggle on the basis of wrong ideas of the Narodnik down the path of individual terror. Later on the basis of Marxism. In 1893, Lenin began in earnest his career at the age of 98. The Russian Social Democratic Party was. 1901, a wave of strikes began in Rostov-on-Don that mobilized workers. It was in that context a great upswing strikes that first Bolshevik cadres were won over, and I'll just give a few. Sverdlov in 1901 was already admitted Marxist. At the age of Noviev joined the party. At the age of that very same year, Kamenev was arrested for exile. Bukharin began his political life at the age of Bukharin 6. All these revolutionaries were drawn close to the party and were influenced by the social struggles of they were operating under very difficult conditions, persecuted by the police, arrested. The different waves of young people that joined the party coincided with the waves of social struggle. There were different generations. The earliest one, the one from 1898, the generation of Lenin, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin. But then we have the generation of 1905 and finally that of 1917. And this living experience of trying to build the organization under very turbulent conditions were vital to shape the Bolshevik understanding of the role of the youth. After 1917, the Bolsheviks began to debate the role of the new generations in the building of a new society. These ideas can be summed up in Lenin's speech to the Komsomol in 1920. The main task of the youth, Lenin says, is to learn. The youth must learn communism in order to build a communist society. He says, how do we learn communism? We have to learn the entire heritage of humanity, including the knowledge that was accrued under the bourgeoisie. This is a critical task for the youth. It must catch up with the knowledge of humanity as a whole and get the necessary materials to build a new society. We don't know how communism will exactly look like, but we certainly know that science, even as developed by the bourgeoisie, will not be discarded. But science will not be put at the service of greed and of war, but will rather be used for the benefit of humanity whole, to find new cures for diseases and to develop new technologies. But as is the case with all the revolutionaries, Marx, Engels, Lenin and Trotsky did not learn only from books, but from the living struggle as well in the schools, in the factories, in the strikes. One can only become a real communist when one is able to link theory and the books, the living struggle of the working class against capitalist society. As Marxist said, this was the school of Bolshevism. The only revolutionary class in bourgeois society is the working. The contradictions created by the bourgeois regime turned the most exploited class under this society to the only force that can destroy the current system. Not a bulb shines, not a wheel turns without the kind permission of the working class. And it will be amongst the youth of this class that the revolution will find its strongest and most enthusiastic point of support.
Thank you, comrade. The next speaker is Lukas from Germany, followed by Isaias from...
Hello, comrades. All over the world, we are confronted with questions like these. Why are you founding this international? Do we really need another communist organization? There are so many other groups. What makes us stand out? Often, people then suggest that all of the different groups on the left should overcome their differences and unite. That's their understanding on how one should build a Marx party and gain influence among the working class. Question of unity was also a central debate in the early days of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. When it was founded in 1898, many small groups gathered all over Russia. These groups stood for very different programs and methods. They were isolated from one another and were mainly concerned with the local struggles around them. The question was how to build a real party from this situation, with a common understanding and a common work. How did Lenin tackle this task? He wrote in 1900, "Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all draw firm and definite lines of demarcation." Since among the different groups affiliating to the party, there were reformers that gave up the political fight against Tsarism and capital. By sticking to purely economic demands like wages and working hours, sought a shortcut to the masses. Programmatic concessions like this is what we call opportunism. They justified their position called economism by explaining that the Russian working class wasn't interested in politics. By doing so, these reformists left the political arena completely to the liberals. And the liberals, as capitalists, of course, had no interest in the emancipation of the workers. Economists, with their program and methods, would have doomed the young Russian party to failure. As Lenin explained, the economists recognized only that part of the class struggle that was acceptable to the liberal bourgeoisie. The economists refused to go farther than the liberal. They refused to recognize the higher form of class struggle which is unacceptable to the... Lenin said that the economists communists abandoned the Marxist, revolutionary conception of the class struggle and became liberal workers' politicians. Today, reformism stands as the most important pillar of capitalism. As we know, most states recognize the right to strike as a way to release some built-up tension in society. So class struggle has to embrace higher sphere of politics also. And as Lenin said, in a sphere of politics, it has to go deeper than minor matters. Marxism recognizes class struggle as fully developed when it takes in the most important part of politics, the organization of state power. At the same time, Lenin didn't separate the economic from the political struggle to overthrow capitalism. By participating in local spontaneous fights, parties should win over the most advanced layers of the. That's what Lenin suggested in the early days of Russian social democracy. He wanted to raise the level of consciousness and not tell the workers what they already knew. Lenin sought to unify the local struggles to a nationwide fight against Tsarism and capitalism. And his plan to achieve this was a nationwide newspaper. He wrote, "Economic struggle that is not united by a central organ cannot become the class struggle of the entire Russian proletariat." A newspaper is a transmission belt for a party, as it allows constant agitation and propaganda. It allows us to make political comments on the different struggles and raise the level of consciousness. It also serves as a platform for the best methods for the struggles. In 1900, Lenin launched such a newspaper. It was called Iskra, and this Iskra stood for Revolutionary Communist Program. Tendency around the paper managed to become the dominant force in the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party by its second Congress in 1903. Lenin disproved the main argument of the economists in practice. He won over the most advanced layers of the Russian working class to a revolutionary communist program. Tendency around Iskra was the base on which the Bolshevik Party was later built. So what can we learn from this all today? Around the world, the youth and the most advanced layers of the working class are looking for revolutionary ideas, our ideas. If we water down our program, we won't reach those layers. Same is true when we join sides with those who will betray the movement, like the reformists or the petty bourgeois activists who want to limit the struggle, like we can see right now globally with the university occupations. Of course, we will join our class in battle no matter their leadership, but we do so with our own program, the program of a revolutionary communism. This way, we will reach the most advanced layers now and train them to become professional revolutionaries. We built this international as the leadership for the coming world revolution. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Lucas. The next one is Isaias from Sweden, followed by Tom from the US.
Iran passed end of the serious discussion cadre organ after failure of uprising. The Revolutionary Youth Committee asked them, what should we do now? A minority of these Revolutionary Youth Committees call themselves communists. And I would like to read a statement published less than a year ago where they explain the following: a communist cadre in revolutionary conditions, in conditions that pose the question of power, can organize thousands. And because of this, the most important task for us currently is to stimulate the formation of secret cells and to try to develop revolutionary cadres. This, in our opinion, is the most important task. And what is to be done is being widely circulated in Iran. The revolutionary youth, reading what is to be done, see an enormous parallel with Tsarist Russia at that time and Iran today. Iran has gone through a period of intensive class struggle for 6 years with constant strikes, yearly uprisings, constant protests. Major difference being that in Iran, there isn't a conscious Marxist movement, just a vague memory of the old Stalinist communist movement. Despite these revolutionary youth calling for cadre organization, they are not Bolshevik. They truly have the heroism of Bolshevik, who even now, in a horribly reactionary situation, after a horrible crackdown since the uprising, where 400 have been executed, tens of thousands have been arrested, they continue their political work, but they lack completely the political understanding, political theory. They're completely ultra-left. They confuse themselves for the masses and their own consciousness for the masses constantly. In the past 6 years, there have been various workers' organizations for different programs of minimum demands, and they completely reject them and say the only program they have is the socialization of production and down with the Islamic Republic. But there is something positive in this, that they are consciously do not want to create any illusions in liberalism or in bourgeois democracy. What is precisely is needed is a transitional program linking the minimum demands of the masses to the struggle for socialism, precisely what Lenin did. The other, a bit insane example, the question of Soviets during the uprising. There were Soviets in the Iranian Revolution 1979, and there's a memory of this. But during the uprising, these communists started calling their revolutionary cells for Soviets. It would be like if our American comrades during the BLM movement started renaming their branches Soviet of New York, the Soviet of Boston, and so forth. These questions could be quite easily answered by studying the history of Bolshevism. There's an enormous parallel between Tsarist Russia and Iran. Both are dictatorships, underdeveloped countries. question how to relate to democratic demands and liberals and reformists would be easily answered. That the necessity of having clear class independence, but supporting all democratic reforms and demands. But unfortunately, these ideas have been buried in Iran. Firstly, the communist movement in Iran was a Stalinist movement. The original Communist Party created in the Comintern was executed during the purges. After that, Soviet Union, the Stalinists created a pure Stalinist party with no connections to both. Purely a caricature. They would talk about that they have a cadre organization, but honestly, when a few comrades recently read about this party's history, they said it sounded more like a European social democratic party than a communist party. Among other things, the horribly low political good measure of this is the lack of material which was translated in Persian in this mass party, the Tudeh party. And you cannot have a revolutionary cadre organization without theory, because that is the foundation of that organization function. At the same time, to these ultra-lefts who mainly understand the question of a cadre organization purely security fail to understand that the question of a cadre organization lies in how the class struggle develops from a revolutionary minority which can be won over in a revolution. And this is also how we as an international stand out. Precisely as one of the Brazilian comrades, quoting Lenin to Bakunin, the Stalinist party created obedient fools. I will take Iran as an example. This party, the Tudeh party, led the working class in slaughter after slaughter, the same mistake. Question of precisely the role of our international is to be a beacon of the genuine ideas of Bolshevism, which are especially relevant to countries like Iran in the tough decade, but also universal conclusions. I feel like I'm repeating what every comrade says, but the importance of revolutionary theory, abstract, but to the concrete, understand the actual living movement of the world. On this basis, we will be able to build not only an organization like the Bolsheviks, but I hope better than the Bolsheviks in many ways. Give countries like Iran, who have been robbed by Stalinism, the leadership they have deserved, proper leadership to overthrow capitalism.
Thank you. Thank you, comrades. The last speaker for this session is Tom from the US, followed by this.
Comrades, if you look at the history of the socialist communist movement, country after over the decade, you see over time the leadership a leadership trend towards opportunism, and in some cases the disintegration of the parties and the organizations. And we have to understand why, which is of course partially a result of the power of the ruling class, the power of the bourgeoisie. Bourgeoisie, particularly in its control of media and education, is able to be a powerful factor in shaping so-called public opinion. And this public opinion tends to weigh on the leadership of the communist and socialist parties, and even on the cadre. Now, if the communists, when we take over state power around the world, we can take the media and the education system away from the bourgeoisie. We won't have to worry about them affecting or shaping public opinion. But the key question is, how do we go from where we are today to that point? And Lenin and the Bolsheviks show that it's only through the building of Marxist cadre organization we can achieve. Now, Trotsky said that the Bolshevik Party was, at least at the time that he wrote, was the greatest party ever been, greatest Marxist. Yes, and even that party did degenerate. But when the Bolsheviks degenerated, because they were isolated for a prolonged period of time in a backward country. In effect, the responsibility for the degeneration of the Bolshevik Party was not really with the Bolsheviks. That responsibility was on the shoulders of the revolutionaries outside of Russia who failed to build the Marxist cadre organization. We all know if Marxist cadre organizations had been built in Germany, in France, in Italy, and other countries prior to when that revolutionary wave hit, the results would have been very different. So our task is to build a thinking Marxist cadre who can use the Marxist method to analyze the situation and to guide our political intervention, so that we can intervene in the masses but not adapt bourgeois public opinion. Now, this takes patience and time to build such an organization. Sectarians and reformists are always looking for shortcuts. Some of them will quote Lenin and say, politics really begins when you're intervening millions. Yes, we want to, and we need forces that are able to pressure from the bourgeois. Comrades, I think the key is that we must get most what we have in our organization. Take that and try not to overextend our force. But if we overextend, we can overextend for a period, but otherwise we will succumb to those pressures. Just want to end on this. So important. Revolutionary Communism workshop. We are the only political force on the planet that's serious. We don't have a workshop on this subject to criticize it. We have a workshop on this subject to learn from. That's why we're going to succeed.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks to all the comrades that were able to speak, and apologies to Elias from. I think we had a great discussion, and I think greater part will be the sum up by.
I want to sum up one of Lenin's strengths, perception. Part of thinking dialectic, not just looking at the past and analyzing the past. It's always easier in hindsight to look back and say, oh, there was a process folding. Now I see what was happening. The trick is to perceive that process as it's unfolding around you when it's not easy to see the limits of the current situation and how they're going to shape the next situation. You start to anticipate where things are going. You can't write an article and teach someone to think that way. You can't just pick that up out of a book. It's a habit of thought. Study hundreds of articles, and if you study the whole history, there you can start to assimilate that habit of thought. Lenin was always concerned with analyzing the stage that the movement was passing through. Like everything else in history, you have a certain stage, there are limits to the current phase. You can see a new phase coming on the horizon. You can prepare for it. The thing is that when you take a step forward, when the movement goes from one stage to the next stage, then inevitably it brings new contradictions. It brings new problems that you didn't see before. And then the critical thing is, do you perceive the new situation, see the new problems? Now, obviously, the movement, it's not that Bolshevism develops always through the same stages. It's like society doesn't always move through exactly the same stages. But I think it always has the same initial stage. This whole thing, if building a Bolshevik force of cadres depends on creating Marxists, training a core of people who can think in this special way and see the world through this special lens, and that process cannot get started, it can't get up on its feet till you have Marxism, till you have it sinking roots. Lenin explains that Russia achieved Marxism in a dramatic way because of the agony that it had gone through over decades of trying to overthrow the Tsar with the wrong ideas, the agony of Narodnism. And when Plekhanov allowed Marxism he planted the seed when he brought that idea into Russia. It's not just that his books were so well written that everyone got it, it's that. There was a number of factors, but I would say that one of the important was they brought Marxism into Russia by the roots. Plekhanov was explaining Marxist philosophy. It's not just like a high level, like here are the main ideas of Marxism. He was explaining this is how Marxism emerged. This materialist view, it's so powerful, it's the result of the entire Enlightenment. 300 years of human thought produced this kind of materialism. The ability to think dialectically and apply materialism consistently was thanks to a contribution that Hegel made. And in turn, Hegel came to his conclusions of systematizing dialectics because he studied all of philosophy and analyzed the process as it was unfolding from one stage to the next. In nature or even in architecture, if you want something solid that's going to endure, something that's going to last, all about the foundations. How well rooted is it? And I love this analogy of roots themselves. The rooting process, you plant a seed, the way it begins. First embryonic seed, the first part of the seedling that comes out is always a special root, first root. It always goes straight down. It has one task, to achieve depth. In English, we call this the taproot. This is a special root. It grows, and if you look at a diagram of a plant, there's always one big root that's going straight down, and then laterally there's other roots that come. The strength of that root, the strength of the depth, anchor, going to determine how solid that plant. And if it gets severed, if the taproot dies, plant dies. The ability of hundreds and then thousands of people to become materialists, to really understand Marxism in a deep way in Russia, laid the basis for everything else that came. You couldn't have had any of this history if you didn't have that root first. And it's easy to look back and say, like, all of the history that the Bolsheviks went through, the battles on the barricades and the Tsarist repression and the Duma, it could seem like the study groups was like the easy part. I think the truth is at every stage, from beginning to end, there was always a pressing battle. There was always a particular obstacle, the main obstacle. And at the early stage, achieving that depth was the obstacle. Becoming Marxist was the first obstacle, and it took a lot of effort. Think about being a factory worker in the 1890s, and you have a 12-hour day. Physically exhausted, you're mentally exhausted, and late at night you're going to go to a reading group. There's actually an eyewitness account in the Bolshevism book that describes someone that participated in one of these. There's a reading group of young women, young factory workers in a factory. Describe them soap workers, sugar workers, pale, thin, red-eyed, gather late in the evening, and they would sit up until 1 in the morning in a stuffy room with a little gas lamp burning. Be learning about philosophy and history and sitting there they were entranced, listening to the talks, asking questions, reading these forbidden books, and forgetting that they were about to have to trudge through the snow in the middle of the night to get back home and go to the factory again the next day. Bolshevism is the determination to smash all obstacles. In that stage, that was the obstacle to be smashed. And the movement was ready to take another step forward, and they noticed it because they saw what was happening in society. In the 1890s, the big strike wave, there's ferment. And they realized it's time to go from like the study circles, we need to turn outward agitation, connect with the workers. It was a widespread phenomenon. It was a general shift. Everyone realized it. There must have been a big energy, a big excitement about now it's the time for agitation. That was a new phase of the movement, but it brought new challenges, new contradictions, new problems. In fact, this problem of economism, of watering down, of leaving the politics aside, is a result of that turn. Go into the fact they're trying to connect with the workers, and if it's hard to make it in a deep way, then they try to make it a connection in a superficial way. When Marxism reached a full bloom in Russia, and you had this period where everyone became a Marxist, that everyone included the intelligentsia and a big section of the liberal bourgeoisie. They were saying, Marxism is arguing that the logic of history is our feudalism is going to be overthrown, and then the bourgeoisie comes to power. That's us. Found a justification for their own aspirations in Marxism, so they started giving money to the Marxists. All of these circles, they're blooming, they're getting all of this, the book publishers are publishing all this Marxism. That was good, but it had a cost. It had a contradiction. That was a period of legal Marxism. And those distortions were the main problem for years in the whole movement. The whole battle with Menshevism came out of people that were trained by distorted version of Marxism. So again, the whole thing is you realize every step forward you take is going to bring a new contradiction that you have to perceive. Being a materialist and being a dialectician means you have the two tools, the two instruments that you need to perceive those changes as they're happening. That's the only way that a party of revolutionaries can defy the immense pressures that they come under. To realize that becoming a Marxist means you're taking a stance that puts you against the current of the dominant flow of ideology in society. And only if you're really grounded, if your stance is really firm, can you have any chance of withstanding that current. You lack the depth, you're going to get swept with it, and you're not even going to realize it. It's happened to the rest of the left. But it's not just the creation of the objective factor has to connect with something outside of it. You need to have this Marxist force, this Bolshevik force, but it needs to emerge at a time when there's something happening in the class struggle, something that we don't control. Two different processes, they develop independently till they're ready to intersect. And we're living in a time when we can see this intersect, comrades, possible. A couple weeks ago, the New York Times conducted an opinion poll on registered voters in the US. It was a special election, a rematch. And they found that 14% of registered voters, they want to see the entire economic and political system torn down. I did the math. That's 24 million people. Probably a lot of the same people who were in the streets 4 years ago. There's another 89 million voters who want to see fundamental changes to the political and economic system. On top of that, there's another 80 million people who don't bother registering to vote. Don't see the point. So put together those 80 million non-registered and the 89 who want fundamental change, 169 million people. There's a minority of 24 million who already want to tear it down. How do you organize those 24 million to convince the other 169 million patiently? Change that they're looking for is the end of capitalism. What will it take to organize them to actually do the job, actually carry out the thing they want to do? That's the question we've been discussing, comrades. That's the task of Bolshevism.
Thanks, Antonio. Thank you for the great discussion. Just as a reminder, we have to study the ideas, so go to the bookshop and take them. We will now break for lunch. Bye-bye to the comrades looking from home.